What an alien told a pastor about the return of Jesus will change what you think you already know. Before the end of this story, you will find parts of your faith rearranged, pieces that felt unshakable turned into questions you did not expect to ask. Listen through, because the kind of revelation Michael Reed received under the streetlight was not spectacle. It was a wound of truth that led him to tears and to a harder kind of peace. Michael Reed, 57 years old, retired senior pastor of a Midwestern congregation, widower for 8 years, spent his nights in prayer and his days answering letters. He had a voice that taught, hands that had baptized hundreds, and a doubt that had begun as a small ache and then grew like water in a basement. It was a quiet January night when he walked across the church parking lot with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee, the asphalt hissing faintly where the heat under the streetlight met the cold. The air smelled of wet wool and old hymnals, his breath came out in soft white ghosts, and the sodium lamp painted halos on the puddles. He paused because he saw a figure standing by his car, no light in its eyes, only a reflective stillness. He called out, and the answer did not come as sound, but as a meaning that slotted into his mind like a key. Inscribe yourself now to this channel to follow more testimonies like this. Now, go back with me to the lot, the lamp, the motes of falling rain, and the moment Michael decided to listen. The parking lot smelled of oil and rain. The gravel under his shoes made a thin, tired crunch. The chain-link fence tapped softly as wind found it. Michael approached slowly, every muscle aware, his flashlight beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the dark. Up close, the figure was not quite human proportions, not exactly a stranger, a body standing with hands folded as if in respect. Its surface was neither skin nor clothing. It reflected the lamp like dull metal, and yet seemed to absorb light into a deep, small darkness. He tried to speak, to name himself, to ask what business it had on consecrated ground. The reply arrived not in syllables, but in a pressure behind his eyes, a clear sentence like a verse remembered. Michael Reed, I come with an understanding of return that will ask you to change what you preach. His throat tightened. He answered aloud because he could not own the interior voice. Who are you? I am a passerby outside the stars, the presence said, and the voice sounded in his chest. In the space of seconds, the familiar rules of prayer, church, and scripture rearranged themselves inside him. The parking lot took on a threshold quality, cold and sacred at once. Michael made a decision that felt absurd and inevitable. He invited the stranger into the church. Thought of rules, of police, of the congregation, of scandal, yet the figure's calm kept him steady. He opened the heavy wooden door, felt the grain press into his palm, heard the old hinges sing a rusty note, and the sanctuary swallowed the rain light. Mary Hargrove, who cleaned the chapel on Tuesdays and who had known Michael since childhood, would later say she thought she saw two shadows crossing the stained glass. Officer Miguel Santos, who checked the property once a week, would later find the exterior lock untouched and the four-wheel drive tire prints only of Michael's truck. Inside the church, the air was warmer and smelled of beeswax and cedar. Michael switched on a lamp, the light pooling over the pulpit, and the visitors sat in a pew as if accustomed to the place. The first verbal exchange began there, between pulpit and pew. An ordinary space turned into a room for impossible testimony. "Why are you here on a night like this?" Michael asked, voice low, fingers folded around the lamp switch. "You asked to see," the visitor said plainly. "I did not call you. Who sent you?" Michael pressed. "No one in your terms sent me. I came because the pattern here needed a witness," the visitor answered. "A witness?" Michael repeated, the word vibrating with the memory of courtroom oaths and altar vows. "Yes, a witness to a kind of return, one that is less about arrival and more about awakening," the visitor replied. "Awakening how?" Michael asked, the question heavy with pastoral responsibility. "To a frequency of consciousness that we perceive as the signal you name return," the visitor said. "Are you saying Jesus does not return as we believe?" Michael's voice tightened. I say the return as expectation of spectacle is not the only truth. There is a frequency, a turning of collective attention that accomplishes what you call return, the visitor said. That sounds like theory, not scripture, Michael said, thinking of sermons practiced for years. It is an insight from observing many worlds, the visitor said, and one very particular pattern I have seen in human hearts. Outside, a car door slammed on the far street, a dog barked, rain made a soft hiss against the windows, the heater clicked like a measured heartbeat. The conversation lengthened into a slow, intimate unraveling. Michael's senses tightened, 6 or 7 threads of perception knitting into a new awareness. He tasted the metallic tang of adrenaline on his tongue, heard the dust settle when the visitor's voice paused, felt the soft wool of his coat under his hand as he pressed it to his chest, smelled wax and rain, and saw the visitor's reflection in the gleaming hymnals. The visitor's presence had a texture, a frequency Michael could name only by testing it against prayer. The visitor spoke, and then, in a series of exchanges that would become central to the congregation's later retellings, described a vision of Jesus not as a single event, but as a wave of awakening. The voice did not mock Scripture. It referenced names and phrases Michael recognized, but reframed them. Return, the visitor said softly, is how a presence is re-encountered when enough people shift in attention, when the world is tuned to the fundamental frequency of compassion and truth. Michael listened like a man in a confessional who had his life stripped bare. The meeting turned, slowly, toward accountability. I do not deny the power of your scriptures, the visitor said. I offer a map of how encounter can happen again without expectation of celestial theater. Michael asked for proof. The visitor promised a demonstration, a small personal proof inside Michael's own mind. There were reasons Michael was susceptible. He had carried loss in the bones of his sermons. He had lost his wife, Ruth, to an illness that had left him both emptied and full of rituals. In the first of the backstory paragraphs, as a child in a small riverside town, he learned to sing hymns by listening to his mother hum at dawn, the smell of coffee and flour entering the chords. He remembered the wooden slats of the home church, the preacher who taught him to hold a Bible like holding a lamp. Those early senses had taught him to measure truth by warmth, by the sound of a congregation breathing in unison, by the stained glass colors when light struck. In the second paragraph, as a seminarian, he studied Scripture with a hunger that bordered on devotion. He cut his teeth on Greek verbs and church history. He learned to prize doctrine and the hermeneutic method. He once stayed up all night with a text, candles melted near his fingers, because he believed that truth could be clarified by effort. In the third paragraph, his marriage to Ruth had been a partnership of prayer and silence, their ritual small but powerful, the smell of her hair oil a memory he could still summon. When she died 8 years ago, the rituals gave him something steady to hold, and he doubled down on ministry as a way of staying connected to her and to purpose. In the fourth paragraph, in the present, at 57, he felt the ache of a vocation that had become maintenance, letters piling on his desk, a congregation aging, his sermons sometimes offered from memory rather than revelation. The visitor's arrival cracked open a compartment in which grief sat. The backstory is a soft sensory archive that explains why Michael both feared change and longed for it. The first proof the visitor offered was perceptual and subtle. It was not thunder or miraculous light, but a tactile proof that would make Michael weep. The visitor placed a finger, or what Michael perceived as a finger, to his forehead. There was an initial electric sting like a small static shock, and then a cascade of images that were scenes not from his life, but from a larger fabric. He saw, in bursts, wide, slow images of people across cities and fields, hands reaching for one another, a child in a market stopping to feed a bird, a doctor hesitating in a hallway and choosing compassion. He experienced in a compressed instant the sound of thousands of varied prayers turning into a single low tone. The visitor explained, in exchanges, that the touch was a calibration, a frequency tuning that allowed Michael to perceive return as a pattern rather than an arrival. Dialogue inside the sanctuary expanded, with Michael asking questions and the visitor answering in ways that tested his categories. There were 10 to 12 exchanges in length for each key scene, and in this first demonstration, they stacked like a ladder. "What did you do?" Michael asked once the sensation faded. "I harmonized the portion of your neural attention to the frequency that corresponds to radical compassion," the visitor replied. "Do you mean you altered me?" "Only in the same way a bell is altered when you strike it. You vibrate, then you return to rest, but you are changed by what you resonate with," the visitor said. "Is that ethical?" Michael asked, mind racing with pastoral concerns. "It is consented by your deep longing," the visitor answered, "but you may choose what to do with what you have seen." The visitor used terms that sounded like metaphor and like science at once. It spoke of resonance, of patterns of attention, of fields of relation. Michael, who had read both scripture and a few popular books on consciousness, found himself in a space where theology and a kind of cosmological observation braided together. He asked for more concrete descriptions. The visitor obliged, and in doing so, the scene required a brief technical aside that Michael would later recount to journalists. The recording device on Michael's desk had captured no voiced sentence from the interior exchange, because the communication was largely telepathic. However, the red light of the recorder had blinked for 8 minutes. An analysis of the recording, done later by Dr. Ana Ruiz, a neuroscientist consulted by the church, described minute microfluctuations in ambient electromagnetic noise over the 8-minute span. The description of the analysis is this in plain terms. The researchers filtered the audio to isolate frequencies below 300 Hz, and then used a Fourier transform to visualize persistent harmonics that coincided with the time of the perceived vision. Background hum and building systems were ruled out by cross-referencing similar recordings at the same location on different nights. The result did not prove telepathy, but it suggested an anomalous energetic event correlated with Michael's subjective report. The church echoed with the sound of the visitor's voice as the conversation shifted to scripture. He quoted a line that Michael recognized from the gospel, and then recast it. "Many shall be called, but few will come," the visitor said, is about call and selection, yes, but it also encodes a description of attention. When attention is distributed under fear, the call is scattered. When attention concentrates in compassion, the call is answered. Michael asked, "Are you telling me Jesus meant consciousness, not spectacle?" "I am telling you that the function attributed to return has been observed, and in many worlds, what you call the presence is an emergent property of collective resonance," the visitor replied. The language was precise and oddly humble, which made the claim more unnerving. Over hours of dialogue, Michael tested the visitor with questions about prophecy, about judgment, about grace. The visitor layered answers and images that forced Michael to rewrite the way he thought about salvation. 3 moments of tension in the night pushed Michael closer to decisions he never imagined he would have to make, and each moment deserves its own intensified pause. First, when the visitor named the grief he had not voiced, the loss of Ruth. It felt like violation and mercy at once. Michael retracted briefly, hands shaking, memory flooding him with the last night he held her. He asked through a trembling mouth, "Why would you know that?" The visitor answered, "I follow signatures of attachment. Grief resonates. It is loud." For roughly 500 to 600 characters, that moment was dense, a private memory exposed. In 2 short paragraphs, Michael either recoiled or surrendered. He chose the latter, and the surrender was not capitulation, but partnership. Second, a neighbor, Daniel Price, knocked on the church door unexpectedly, called by curiosity, and peered through a window to see 2 figures. The sudden external interruption created public risk, a fear of scandal. Daniel's flashlight beam trembled across the stained glass. Michael had to decide whether to explain or to conceal.
He stepped out into the cold and spoke to Daniel with a voice that carried both authority and confession. "I asked for something I did not expect to receive," he said. Daniel, who knew the pastor intimately, pressed, "Is this safe?" Michael could not promise. In those paragraphs, the tension held like a wire. Third, when local pastor Reverend John Wallace called the next morning with questions and threats of denouncement, Michael felt the institution close in. He had to choose between loyalty to doctrine and loyalty to what he had seen. The paragraphs describing his sleepless nights after the call captured the moral calculus, the memories, the fear, and the small, steady voice that told him to sit with what he had experienced. As word wandered slowly, names accumulated around the event. Sarah Milton, one of the deacons, stood by Michael at the window and later volunteered to transcribe his notes. Mark Tobias, a young elder with a background in electronics, brought a handheld recorder and later tried to reproduce the harmonics. Reverend John Wallace called the event dangerous on a morning radio show. Dr. Ana Ruiz offered to run tests. Officer Miguel Santos made a note in his log, no signs of forced entry. Emily Carter, a Sunday school teacher,
And Michael's niece delivered coffee and silence in equal measure. Daniel Price, the neighbor, would later say his curiosity turned into respect. Across the town, the story radiated like ripples. The core conceptual revelation the visitor laid out was both simple and destabilizing. It proposed that return could mean a collective tuning of attention, a reconfiguration of how people oriented themselves ethically and spiritually, and that such tuning could produce experiences that were indistinguishable from the traditional idea of a return. The visitor described this through images, like concentric ripples on water caused by a single stone. It explained that on other worlds, communities orchestrated rituals of attention that acted like lenses, concentrating compassion until a palpable presence manifested. The visitor used evocative, often technical language, mapping attention as a pattern of neural and social dynamics. It spoke of frequency, resonance, phase alignment, terms Michael had only encountered in a popular science column. The explanation stretched across hours, dense with metaphor, and yet it offered testable suggestions. It was not dogma forced upon the church. It asked for experiments of the heart. There was a long moment of dialogue where Michael, skeptical and curious, requested that the visitors show him a vision that would be unambiguous, something that had both theological weight and plausibility. The visitor agreed to grant a vision, but warned about the cost. To see as we see is to understand the continuity of life beyond your categories, it said. Michael consented, with hands that smelled of wax and palms that trembled. The visitor asked him to close his eyes, to breathe slowly, to find a center. When Michael closed his eyes, he felt the room sharpen in a way he had never experienced. He heard distant bells, a chorus of languages like wind through reeds, the scent of sea salt layered over cedar. The vision assembled quickly and precisely. He saw a city on a world that was not Earth, where people lived in levels stacked like terraces, and a teacher moved among them with quiet, invisible authority. He saw a version of a man recognized as Jesus, not performing signs for spectacle, but walking among people, attending to small things, mending a garment, settling a dispute between neighbors. He saw empathy spread like a visible light when someone offered an honest apology. The images were sensory-rich, the heat of the market, the tang of citrus in the air, the roughness of a woven cloth. It was not simple, it was subtle, and it reframed his image of ministry. That vision carried a long explanation about cosmology, about the ways different intelligences perceived incarnation and return. The visitor spoke of how cultures on other worlds practiced what it called attention tending, rituals to focus communal care. It suggested that what theologians had called Christ was sometimes the emergent property of such attention, not always a single historical interruption. Michael listened, his chest heavy with tears, feeling a grief and a release that were not contradictory. His voice cracked when he asked, "Are you taking away the miracle?" The visitor answered, "I am putting miracle back into the hands of people.
The miracle has always been in your choosing, in aligning with what is true. Around a third of the way through this narrative, when the mental weight of the revelation is at its peak and the viewer is both intellectually engaged and emotionally unsettled, it is important to pause and invite community engagement. If you felt a chill when the visitor said that return might look like attention, you are not alone. Share what first came to your mind. Start your comment with, "For me," and then tell us the very first image or feeling you had when Michael described return as a frequency. Your words help others to see that private shifts happen in public spaces, and your testimony may comfort someone who is wrestling with the same questions. This channel is a place where doubt and wonder are both welcome. Your comment will not be judged. It will be read, and sometimes we will read aloud selections in future episodes to show how diverse responses can deepen our understanding. Now, back to Michael and the choices he had to make after receiving a vision that both affirmed and unsettled his faith. The vision precipitated a second intense moment of tension, this one public and piercing. Michael chose to recount the vision to Sarah and Mark, who sat in the dim vestry while rain tapped the roof. The conversation that followed between three people crossed 10 exchanges easily, a measured back and forth where each line tested the integrity of the experience. "Describe the city again," Sarah asked, precise and gentle. Michael tried, each detail feeling both vivid and fragile. Mark demanded evidence, suggesting they run a test with audio equipment. Sarah worried about reputational risk. Their debate stretched, emotions fraying, and the church's future hung like an uncertain cord. When the story reached the ears of Reverend John Wallace, he reacted with denunciation on air, calling for a council. The community split along lines of curiosity, fear, and loyal defense. That rupture became the third major tension point, another 500 to 600 character moment, where ties that had seemed unbreakable showed their capacity to be rearranged. Michael's internal crisis deepened when he began to perceive the social cost. He received a letter from the denomination warning of scandal, and Maria Gonzalez, a longtime member, expressed fear for the children. At the same time, others like Emily Carter and Daniel Price sought solace in the possibility that the story invited. Michael had to decide whether to go public with the visitor's insight as a sermon, to tell his congregation that their image of return might be broader than they had thought. In quiet nights, he wrestled with the question of pastoral responsibility. This conflict is described in a pair of paragraphs that hold his sleepless calculations, the memory of Ruth, the sense of being small in a long chain of interpreters. When he finally addressed the congregation, the service was full, the pews smelling faintly of coffee and old books, candles lit, voices hushed. He did not preach with theatrical flourish. He told the story simply, recounting the figure in the parking lot, the touch, the vision, the reframing of return as attention. The conversation that followed with deacons and laypeople lasted long into the night. There were 20 or more exchanges across small groups, each person asking, probing, asserting, or confessing. Reverend John Wallace refused to attend, calling the account heretical. Yet others came forward with their own small experiences of awakening, times when a neighbor's kindness had felt like a visitation. The public airing did not resolve the theological debates, but it created a space where doubt and testimony coexisted. The proof's accumulation included technical steps. Mark Tobias and Dr. Ana Ruiz collaborated to analyze the recorder data and the ambient harmonic signatures using accessible methods. They explained in plain language that they used spectral analysis to see persistent frequencies during the 8-minute period. Then compared that baseline with recordings from similar nights with no event. The team also interviewed witnesses, collected contemporaneous notes, and used chain of custody on the recorder to ensure integrity. The description of the process was careful, about 300 characters, meant to build credibility while acknowledging limitations. The technical account did not conclude the matter, it only added a layer of anomaly. The weeks following the event were a slow, transformative season. Michael's sermon shifted in tone from proclamatory certainty to open interrogative invitation. He preached about attention and compassion, about how small acts create larger fields. The visitors' insight about return as a frequency became a motif, a seed planted in sermons, small groups, and private counsel. The community response was mixed but earnest. Sarah organized a series of listening circles where members practiced focused attention. Mark built a small study group to learn the basics of sound and frequency analysis. Dr. Ana Ruiz gave a public talk about the limits and potentials of correlational evidence. Reverend John Wallace continued to denounce. The social texture of the town changed, sometimes quietly, sometimes in sharp argument. There were additional moments of intensity that required careful narration. One was the night a journalist, Lena Park, came with a camera and asked questions that the elder members felt could be exploitative. Her presence forced Michael into a public defensive stance. He answered her questions with as much honesty as he could, acknowledging both his certainty about the felt reality and his limits in proof. Another tension arose when a visiting theologian, Professor James Cartwright, wrote an op-ed that both praised Michael's courage and worried about the methodological slip from revelation to social experiment. The op-ed amplified the discussion nationally and introduced new voices into the town. A final tension occurred when a young man named Tyler, influenced by the visitor's notion of attention, attempted a public tuning that resulted in emotional distress for some participants and raised ethical questions about untrained manipulations of attention. The transformation of Michael himself was both interior and public. He stopped wanting to be the man who had all the answers. He began to teach practices that oriented people towards simple, repeatable actions. Holding a neighbor's gaze, preferring vulnerability over certainty, choosing reconciliation. He introduced short rituals of communal silence and focused listening, described in practical steps so they could be followed without esotericism. The curious thing was that some people reported experiences that felt like the visitor's description, more moments of presence, less spectacle. The work of translating a cosmic insight into local practice took patience. 1 month later, the church had started small listening circles in parish homes, and Michael kept a daily practice of a 15-minute attention exercise before breakfast. The groups were not large, but attendance was steady. Sarah and Mark recorded sessions, and Dr. Ana Ruiz returned with a small pilot study to observe whether simple practices increased measures of pro-social behavior in the community. The first month felt fragile and hopeful. People shared small stories of changed interactions, like a neighbor forgiving a long-standing grudge or a teacher in the local school choosing a restorative approach. Michael himself felt lighter in some ways, while still holding grief. The community had not resolved doctrinal debates, but there was a visible softening in tone. Those initial 30 days were about practice and boundary setting. Michael learned to answer questions with humility and to invite others into experiments of heart. 3 months on, patterns had begun to form and public perception shifted. The listening circles expanded into an interfaith companion series that included a rabbi from a nearby town and a Buddhist practitioner who taught basic breath attention. Attendance grew and so did scrutiny. Reverend John Wallace organized a formal council to evaluate Michael's ministry. The council met and ultimately issued recommendations that allowed the church to continue, but with oversight. The broader town, once skeptical, began to notice changes in how disputes were handled in small civic meetings. Mark's technical experiments showed modest but consistent increases in self-reported empathy among participants, while Dr. Ana Ruiz published a careful observational report noting correlation, not causation. The 3-month phase was marked by community negotiation and the slow accumulation of small observable effects. Michael had learned to live with ambiguity and to accept that transformation is often incremental. 6 months later, the landscape had adapted to a new normal of cautious curiosity. The church maintained its rhythm of experiments and study. The listening circles were institutionalized into a weekly schedule, and the town's civic associations adopted several restorative practices inspired by the initiative. Some former critics had softened, if not fully convinced. Reverend John Wallace had agreed to attend a public forum, and though disagreement remained, there was dialogue. Sarah ran a program for teens teaching empathy skills that reduced suspensions at the high school.
Dr. Ana Ruiz published a follow-up suggesting more rigorous studies, and a regional theological journal ran an essay on the possibilities and limits of interpreting return in terms of communal attention. For Michael, the most enduring change was internal. He no longer measured his ministry solely by attendance or hymn book familiarity. He watched people choose reconciliation, and he felt that the visitor's insight had transformed not only his sermons, but his pastoral imagination. The 6-month report is the one that showed practical application, social ripples, and a cautious, persistent hope. In the months after, the visitor did not return in the same way, but small instances occurred that reminded Michael of that night. A child in the Sunday school prayed with a tenderness that made everyone cry. A neighbor forgave an old debt publicly. Emily Carter told Michael that once a week she practiced the 15-minute attention exercise and felt less anxious. These were not miracles in the dramatic sense, but they were evidence of a different plumbing at work in communal life. Michael continued to teach that whatever the ontological status of the visitor, the practice of tuning attention toward compassion was useful, ethical, and transformative. The final scenes of the story return to the personal cost and the hard-earned peace. Michael had to face censure from some and gratitude from others. He found friends in unlikely places. He made decisions to protect vulnerable participants from untrained experiments. He continued to care for Ruth's memory, now with less of the ache that had once been constant. At the close of the narrative, he stood once more in the parking lot at night under the same sodium lamp that had witnessed the first encounter. He did not expect to see the visitor again, and he did not need a second visitation to validate the change. He felt instead a steadier current under his feet. To sum up, the revelation the visitor brought was not a denial of Jesus or Scripture. It was a reframing, a proposition that return can be experienced as a reorientation of attention, a widespread tuning toward compassion that creates an emergent presence. For Michael, that reframing opened both grief and gratitude. His community did not all agree, but many learned practices that reduced harm and increased kindness. For you, the invitation is simple. Consider whether the salvation you wait for is also being invited to be expressed in everyday acts that change the field of relationship. The last image is of a congregation that learned to listen more carefully, to notice the small openings where transformation begins, and to hold both doubt and devotion in uncertain hands. If this story moved you, subscribe to continue exploring testimonies that challenge and clarify faith, and leave a comment beginning with, "For me," to share your first impression. Perhaps the greatest surprise in all of this is not that a visitor came, but that we discovered a way to wake up together.